darkness, silence, and then regret. It's late at night. The world outside is asleep, but your mind is restless. You told yourself this was the last time. You swore you wouldn't fall again. Yet here you are, drained, empty, ashamed. You close your eyes, hoping to escape the weight pressing down on your soul, but the guilt lingers, refusing to let go. This isn't just a moment of weakness. This is a war, a battle that seems impossible to win. The same cycle, over and over, again. The struggle, the fall, the regret, and then the promise, never again. But deep down, you know the truth. You know the whisper that comes in the silence, the voice that tells you, you will never be free. But what if that was a lie? What if there was a way out? A path hidden in plain sight, a truth so powerful that it could break these chains once and for all? What if someone had already fought this battle, already suffered through the torment, already discovered the way to victory, and was now reaching out to help you? One man did, and his name was Padre Pio. He knew the dangers of this sin. He knew how it steals your strength, how it clouds your soul, how it distances you from God's grace. And he also knew the way out, a way that is not only possible but promised to those who are willing to fight. Padre Pio revealed 3 liberating secrets, powerful, life-changing, and most importantly, effective. Secrets that can free you from this burden and lead you toward a life of true peace, strength, and holiness. A life where you are no longer a slave. A life where you no longer feel trapped. A life where you no longer wake up with regret. But before we uncover these secrets, I have a question for you. How long will you keep living like this? How many more nights will you spend trapped in this cycle? How much longer will you allow yourself to believe that there is no escape? Because the truth is, freedom is closer than you think. And in just a moment, you will discover how to take that first step toward it. So if you're ready to break free, if you're ready to reclaim your strength, your dignity, and your connection with God, then stay with me until the end of this video. And before we continue, make sure to subscribe to this channel, because here we uncover the truths that no one else dares to speak, truths that have the power to transform lives. And today, it might just transform yours. Now, let's begin. James had always been told that he was meant for something greater. Raised in a devout Christian home, his childhood was filled with prayers before bedtime, Sunday services, and stories about saints who overcame the temptations of the world. He believed in God. He wanted to be good. But deep inside, there was a battle brewing, one that he never expected to fight. It started innocently enough. He was young, curious, and like many others, he stumbled upon things that sparked desires he didn't fully understand. At first, it was just a passing thought, a moment of curiosity. But over time, that curiosity turned into something more. A habit, a secret, a part of his daily routine that no one knew about. And why would they? It seemed harmless. No one was getting hurt. It was just him, alone with his thoughts, giving into a desire that felt natural. But what James didn't realize was that something was changing within him. At first, it was subtle, a restless feeling after each time, like something was missing. He would go about his day as usual, but there was a strange emptiness lingering in the back of his mind, a quiet whisper of guilt, but he brushed it off. After all, the world told him it was normal. Even some of his friends had talked about it as if it were no big deal, so why should he feel guilty? Yet, the more he justified it, the harder it became to ignore the effects it had on him. He began to notice a shift in his spirit, a weakening of his willpower. Prayer became harder. His connection with God, which once felt strong and unshakable, now felt distant. It wasn't that he had stopped believing. He still loved God, still wanted to be a good man. But something was holding him back. He tried to fight it. Some nights, he would promise himself that he would never do it again. He would lay in bed, clenching his fists, determined to break free. and sometimes he would succeed for a while. But then, out of nowhere, the temptation would return. It would start as a small thought, a fleeting image, a passing desire. And, before he even realized what was happening, he had fallen again. Each time, the regret grew heavier. Each time, the whispers of guilt became louder. You'll never be free. You've already failed. Why even try? God is disappointed in you. And the worst part? He started to believe it. It wasn't just about the habit anymore, it was about what it was doing to him. The more he gave in, the weaker he felt. Not just physically, but spiritually. His confidence began to fade. His motivation declined. He found himself avoiding deep prayer, not because he didn't want to talk to God, but because he was ashamed. He felt unworthy. He felt like a hypocrite. Then came the rationalizations. Maybe this wasn't such a big deal. Maybe God understood. Maybe as long as he wasn't hurting anyone, it wasn't really a sin. Maybe he was just being too hard on himself. But no matter how much he tried to excuse it, the truth was undeniable. He didn't feel at peace. And wasn't peace what God promised? James didn't want to admit it, but he knew, deep down, in the quietest corners of his soul, that he was trapped. And the worst prisons are the ones that don't look like prisons at all. He went through his days pretending everything was fine, putting on a smile, engaging in conversations, fulfilling his responsibilities. But inside, he was in chains, and no one knew. No one except God. One night, after another failed attempt to resist, James sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. He was tired. Tired of the cycle, tired of the guilt, tired of feeling like a slave to something that was supposed to be harmless. He whispered a prayer, but it felt weak, empty. God, I don't know how to stop. I don't know if I can, but I don't want to live like this anymore. It was a simple prayer, a desperate cry from a soul that longed to be free. But James had no idea that this moment, this breaking point, was actually the beginning of something greater. Because freedom was possible. It had always been possible. He just needed to find the right path, and that path was closer than he thought. James never thought it would come to this. It had all started as something small, something seemingly insignificant. A passing moment of curiosity, a fleeting impulse. He hadn't even questioned it at first. After all, the world around him seemed to treat it as nothing. It was normal, wasn't it? Everyone did it. No one talked about it as if it were a problem. But then, why did he feel so empty afterward? At first, he brushed that feeling aside. He convinced himself it was just guilt, that it would pass. And for a while, it did. But then, slowly, something changed. The occasional slip turned into a habit. The habit turned into a routine. And before he realized it, James was caught in a cycle that felt impossible to escape. The strange thing was, he had never thought of himself as someone who lacked control. He was disciplined in other areas of his life. He was responsible, he had dreams, he worked hard, he prayed. But with this, he felt powerless. It was a hunger that never seemed satisfied. He would tell himself this is the last time, and for a moment, he believed it. He would clench his fists, take a deep breath, and promise to be stronger. And sometimes he was, for a few days, maybe even a week. But then, the urges would return, and he would try to fight them at first, convincing himself that he could resist, that he wouldn't fall again. Until he did. And the moment it was over, that heavy, suffocating shame came rushing back, a voice in his head whispering, "You failed again." Every time he gave in, it felt like he was chipping away at himself, losing a piece of his soul, falling further away from the man he wanted to be. And the worst part? He started to believe that maybe he would never be free. It was more than just a habit now. It was a prison. James could feel the weight of his choices pressing down on him, suffocating his spirit. He could see it in his life, in the way he had begun to withdraw from people, in the way he avoided looking at himself in the mirror for too long, in the way prayer felt like an obligation rather than a refuge. He still went to church. He still tried to be good. But deep inside, he felt like a hypocrite, like someone living a double life. He would listen to sermons about purity, about holiness, about surrendering to God, and he would nod along, but a voice inside him always said, "That's not you," because how could he lift his hands in worship when those same hands had been used for sin? How could he bow his head in prayer when he couldn't even bring himself to look God in the eye? He started avoiding confession. It wasn't that he didn't want. Forgiveness, he did. But how many times could he say the same words before they lost their meaning? "Father, forgive me, for I have sinned." Again, and again, and again. At what point did God stop listening? At what point did grace run out? The doubt was the worst part. At first, James had always believed in God's mercy. But over time, his failures chipped away at that confidence. He still prayed, but his prayers were weak, empty. "God, I don't even know if you're still there. God, do you even want to hear this anymore? God, am I too far gone?" And in that silence, the enemy's voice grew louder. "You're never going to change. God is disappointed in you. You'll never be strong enough to break free. You might as well stop trying." The guilt was unbearable. And yet, no matter how much he hated himself for it, no matter how many times he swore to never do it again, no matter how many tears he cried, no matter how many times he begged God to take this temptation away, he kept going back because something inside of him had changed. It was no longer just about desire. It was about control, or rather, the lack of it. James no longer felt like he had a choice. It was as if something stronger than him had wrapped its chains around his soul, pulling him in, whispering that resistance was pointless. He wanted to stop. He just didn't know how. And so, he did what so many others did. He buried it. He smiled when people greeted him. He laughed at jokes. He acted normal. Because no one could know. No one could ever know. What would they think of him? What would they say if they knew that behind closed doors he was battling something that felt impossible to defeat? Would they judge him? Look at him differently? Think he was weak? And so he carried his chains in silence. He pretended to be fine. He lived his life as if nothing was wrong. But inside he was breaking. The weight of his failures sat heavy on his chest every day. The longer this went on, the more he lost hope. Because how could God still love someone like him? James had tried everything. He had prayed. He had fasted. He had set rules for himself, tried to distract himself, tried to fill his time with other things. But nothing worked, because the real problem wasn't just his actions, it was his heart. He had become enslaved, not just to his desires, but to his shame. And shame is a powerful weapon. It keeps you silent when you should be speaking. It keeps you hidden when you should be seeking help. It keeps you convinced that no one else would understand, that you're the only one struggling, that you're too broken to be fixed. And worst of all, shame convinces you that even God is ashamed of you. And once you believe that, you stop fighting. James was on the edge of that darkness. A part of him was ready to give up, to accept that this was just his reality now. But deep inside, a small, almost imperceptible voice still whispered, "There has to be more than this." Could he really believe that? Could he really believe that God hadn't abandoned him? Could he really believe that freedom was possible? James didn't know, but he was about to find out. Because the moment he was ready to give up, something happened, something that changed everything. Now, before we continue, I want to ask you something. If this story has resonated with you, even in the smallest way, I want you to leave a comment below. You don't have to share details. You don't have to explain everything. Just say, "I understand this struggle, because here's the truth. You are not alone. And if you're ready to see what happens next, keep watching. Because what comes next might just be the breakthrough you've been waiting for." James never thought it would come to this. He had always believed he was in control. He had told himself that this was just a small issue, something he could stop whenever he wanted. But as the years passed, the truth became painfully clear. He wasn't in control anymore. It had started as a simple escape, a way to deal with stress, boredom, loneliness. At first, he never thought much about it. The world around him never warned him about it. No one in church talked about it. No one seemed to think it was dangerous. But now, standing in front of his mirror, looking into his own tired, empty eyes, he saw the truth. He was trapped. And worse, he didn't even know when it had happened. There hadn't been a sudden moment where everything fell apart. It had been slow, subtle, a gradual descent into something that had begun to consume him without him realizing it. He saw it now in the way he struggled to focus at work, in the way his relationships felt hollow, in the way his prayers had become weak, distant, filled with guilt rather than faith. James could no longer deny what was happening. This wasn't just a bad habit anymore. It was a prison. It was controlling him. And the scariest part? He didn't know how to break free. It wasn't just a spiritual battle anymore. It was affecting every part of his life. His mind felt foggy all the time. It was hard to focus on even the simplest tasks. He used to be sharp, full of ideas, full of energy. Now it felt like he was constantly drained, like something had stolen his strength without him even realizing it. He found himself procrastinating more and more, avoiding responsibilities, slipping into laziness. And it wasn't just about work. His friendships had started to change too. He used to be present when talking to people, genuinely listening, engaging, making eye contact. But now, even when he was in a room full of people, he felt distant, isolated, as if there was an invisible wall between him and the rest of the world, a wall that he had built himself. But the worst part? The distance he felt from God. James had always believed in God's presence. He had felt it before. He had experienced moments of closeness, of overwhelming peace, of joy. But now, prayer felt forced, cold, empty. Whenever he tried to talk to God, it felt like there was a thick fog between them, like his words didn't reach heaven anymore. And deep inside, James knew why. He knew that sin had built this wall. It wasn't that God had abandoned him. It was that he had allowed himself to be pulled away, inch by inch, decision by decision, until he could barely recognize his own faith anymore. The guilt was unbearable. Every time he fell again, he would tell himself it was the last time, that this time he would really stop. But the cycle repeated, again and again, and with every failure, his self-respect crumbled a little more. He used to be confident. He used to be strong. But now, every time he looked in the mirror, all he saw was someone weak, someone who couldn't even control his own actions, and the enemy knew it. James could hear the whispers in his mind, the accusations, the lies. You're a failure. You'll never change. God is ashamed of you. Why even try? And the more he believed those words, the deeper he fell. Because that's how sin works. It doesn't just damage your soul, it poisons your mind. It makes you believe that you are beyond saving, that grace no longer applies to you, that you are alone. And once you believe that, you stop fighting. James had almost reached that point. He had almost given up. But something inside him refused to die. A small voice, a whisper. There has to be more than this. And even though he wasn't sure if he could still be free, even though he wasn't sure if God was still listening, he knew one thing. He couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. But how? He had already tried everything, hadn't he? He had tried willpower. He had tried making rules for himself. He had tried distractions. He had tried praying. Nothing had worked, and that's when he realized maybe he had been fighting the wrong battle. Maybe this wasn't just about trying harder. Maybe he had been trying to fix an internal spiritual problem with external physical solutions. Maybe the real battle was in his heart, and if that was true, then maybe the only way to win was to stop fighting alone. James didn't know what the answer was yet, but he was about to find out, and when he did, everything would change. Now, before we continue, I want to ask you something. If this story has spoken to you, if you have ever felt this struggle in your own life, I want you to leave a comment below. You don't have to explain everything. You don't have to say much. Just type these 3 words. I need freedom, because you are not alone in this. And if you're ready to see how James found his way out, keep watching, because what comes next, it might just change everything. James had been searching for answers for so long. He felt lost, hopeless, stuck in a cycle that seemed impossible to break. But something inside him refused to give up. Deep within his heart, he knew that there had to be a way out of this darkness. It was late one evening, after another long day of feeling like he was drowning in his own struggles, that he found himself online, aimlessly scrolling through articles. He had been reading countless pieces on addiction, sin, and spiritual warfare. Nothing seemed to click. Nothing seemed to make sense. Nothing was offering the kind of help he so desperately needed. That was until he stumbled upon an article about Padre Pio. He had heard the name before, of course. The famous saint known for his deep spirituality and miraculous powers. But James had never really looked into his teachings. That night, something felt different. Something told him that this was no ordinary coincidence. The article spoke about Padre Pio's incredible faith and how he fought against his own temptations. Temptations that, in many ways, mirrored James's own struggles. It shared how Padre Pio had not only battled his own inner demons, but how he had helped countless others find freedom through discipline, prayer, and sacrifice. The more James read, the more he felt as if Padre Pio's words were speaking directly to him. They weren't just words on a screen. They were like a lifeline being thrown into the ocean of despair he had been drowning in. Padre Pio's teachings were simple, yet profound. They didn't promise an easy way out, but they offered something much more powerful: hope. Hope that, no matter how far down a person had fallen, there was always a way back to purity, peace, and spiritual victory. James found himself gravitating toward 3 key principles that Padre Pio spoke about: discipline, prayer, and sacrifice. At first, the idea of discipline felt daunting to James. He had tried so many times to control himself and manage his behavior, but it had never worked. He had been stuck in the cycle for years, feeling like every effort he made only resulted in failure. But Padre Pio's message was different. It wasn't about controlling every single thought and action perfectly. It was about building a life of steady, consistent self-control. It was about committing to small steps of discipline every day, no matter how difficult, no matter how many times he stumbled. Then came prayer. Padre Pio had a deep, intimate relationship with God. His prayer life wasn't just about asking for things or trying to appease God. It was about pouring out his heart and allowing God to pour back into him. Prayer was where he found strength. Prayer was where he found guidance. Prayer was where he found peace. For James, this was a turning point. He had been praying, of course, but his prayers had become routine, empty words spoken out of obligation. He realized in that moment that prayer had to become a dialogue, not a monologue. It had to come from the heart. It had to be sincere. He had to open his heart to God fully and allow God's grace to work in him, even when he didn't feel worthy of it. And lastly, there was sacrifice. The concept of sacrifice wasn't new to James, but the way Padre Pio described it felt like a revelation. Padre Pio didn't just practice sacrifice out of duty or obligation. He saw it as a way to draw closer to God, a way to make his life an offering to the Lord. James had always been taught that the greatest sacrifice was to give up things for the sake of others, but Padre Pio's words made him realize something different. The greatest sacrifice was the willingness to let go of the things that were keeping him chained to sin. It wasn't just about giving up pleasures. It wasn't about giving up things because they were bad or wrong. It was about giving up the things that were preventing him from living in the freedom that God had promised him. And for James, this meant not only giving up his sinful habit, but surrendering his will, his desires, and his very self to God. As James meditated on these teachings, something inside him started to shift. The weight of the guilt and shame that had burdened him for so long began to feel a little lighter. It wasn't that everything changed overnight, but he felt as though a flicker of hope had been ignited within him. He realized that the path to overcoming his struggle wasn't about perfect success, but about consistent surrender. It wasn't about condemning himself for every failure, but about embracing the grace of God with every step forward. And above all, it was about trusting that God could restore him, no matter how broken he felt. James began to incorporate Padre Pio's principles into his daily life. Each morning he would start with prayer, acknowledging his weakness and asking God for strength. He would focus on small acts of discipline, like avoiding triggers that led to his struggle and redirecting his thoughts to things that would uplift his soul. And he committed to moments of sacrifice, whether it was fasting from distractions or choosing to serve others, anything that would take the focus off himself and back onto God. Little by little, James started to notice a change. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect, but there was a noticeable difference. The cycle of guilt and shame that had held him captive for so long began to loosen its grip. The more he practiced discipline, the more strength he felt. The more he prayed, the more his connection with God deepened. And the more he sacrificed, the more he experienced God's grace. James wasn't completely free yet, but for the first time in a long while, he saw a way out. He had found hope. He had found a way to begin healing, to begin restoring his broken relationship with God, and he knew that no matter how long the road was ahead, he wasn't walking it alone. Padre Pio had shown him the way, and with God's grace, he was determined to keep walking forward. James had always known about the power of faith. Growing up in a devout Christian home, he was familiar with the teachings of the church. Yet, when it came to his own personal struggles, he had never truly understood how deeply his faith could become the weapon he needed to fight back. The temptation had always felt like an invisible force, like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. But now, in this season of his life, he was learning something new, a lesson that would change everything. It began for James with a quiet and personal decision. He would fight back. Not with his own strength, not with sheer willpower, but with the tools that God had given him. And the first tool, the most powerful one, was faith. He remembered the stories of the saints, how they had battled their own struggles and emerged victorious, not by their own efforts, but by relying on the power of God. Saints like Padre Pio, who had not only battled temptations but had turned them into opportunities for spiritual growth. If they could do it, surely he could too. But it would require more than just a fleeting thought. It would require action, discipline, sacrifice, and above all, unwavering faith. James knew that he needed to fortify his will, and he had heard countless times that fasting and prayer were essential parts of that process. But this time, he felt as though he was ready to fully commit. He had tried to overcome this struggle on his own before, relying on sheer willpower. But it was clear now that he needed more. He needed God's help. So, James began fasting. At first, it was hard. He could feel the pull of the old habits, the temptations that had ruled his life for so long. But with each day, he found a little more strength. Fasting wasn't just about giving up food. It was about redirecting his energy, about saying no to the things that had held him captive and yes to the things that would set him free. It was about humbling himself before God, acknowledging his weakness, and asking for the strength to fight. And then there was prayer. James had always known the power of prayer, but he had never prayed with the kind of intensity that he was now. His relationship with God had been something of a routine, a set of words he said every day without much thought. But now, prayer was his lifeline. It was his direct connection to the divine, the moment when he poured out his heart to God, asking for help, strength, and guidance. One of the most powerful prayers James began to incorporate into his daily routine was the Rosary. He had always respected the Virgin Mary, but he had never fully understood the power of asking for her intercession. The Rosary was no longer just a prayer, it was a weapon. Each bead he recited felt like a step forward, a spiritual shield against the enemy's attacks. And when he felt the temptation rise, as it so often did, he would immediately turn to the Rosary, praying with all his heart, asking the Blessed Mother to help him stay strong, to help him resist the urge to fall back into his old ways. With each prayer, each moment of fasting, James began to feel the grip of the temptation loosen. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't always easy, but it was real. His faith was beginning to work in him. Every time he felt weak, every time he felt the pull of his old habits, he would lean harder into his faith. Prayer became his refuge, his shield, his weapon. But it wasn't just about resisting temptation in the moment. It was also about filling his life with things that would keep his mind and heart occupied. He realized that idleness was one of the biggest triggers for him. When he had too much free time, his mind would wander and the temptation would take root again. So, James made a commitment to fill his life with productive, positive activities. He started reading more, not just books about faith, but anything that would engage his mind and keep him focused. He began writing down his thoughts, journaling about his struggles, his victories, and his dreams. He also found ways to serve others. He had always known that helping others was an important part of his Christian walk, but now it became an essential part of his battle plan. Serving others took the focus off himself and redirected his energy towards something good. He found that when he gave his time and attention to helping others, there was less room in his heart for selfish desires. Serving others became a form of spiritual warfare, a way to align his will with God's will. And of course, James continued to pray. Each night before he went to bed, he would kneel beside his bed, offering a prayer of gratitude for the strength he had received that day. He would ask God for protection, for guidance, and for the grace to continue on his journey toward purity. He would pray for those who struggled like he had, asking God to help them find the strength they needed to overcome their own battles. But even with all of this, fasting, prayer, service, James knew that the struggle was not over. It wasn't a battle that would be won in a single day. It was a long, ongoing fight, one that would require every ounce of his energy, every moment of his faith, and every prayer he could muster. There were still days when James felt weak, when the temptation would rear its ugly head again, when he doubted himself and wondered if he could really overcome it. But every time that happened, he would remind himself of the power of faith. He would remind himself that no matter how many times he stumbled, God was always there to pick him up. Every day was a new opportunity to lean into his faith, to trust in God's grace, and to continue the battle. James didn't know when the struggle would end, but he was beginning to see that the battle wasn't just about defeating temptation. It was about drawing closer to God, relying on his strength, and learning to live in the freedom that God had always intended for him. And so, James continued, one day at a time, walking in faith. He knew that as long as he leaned into God, as long as he used his faith as a weapon, he would continue to move closer to victory. Each prayer, each fast, each act of service was a step toward freedom, a freedom that only God could give. I want to ask you, how have you used your faith to battle your own struggles? What tools have you found to help you fight the temptations in your life? Let me know in the comments below. Sharing your story could help someone else who is facing the same battle. Let's keep encouraging each other and fighting together. James had been through a long and challenging journey, one that had taken him to the brink of despair and back. There were moments when he wondered if he would ever break free from the chains of his own desires. The struggle had been real, painfully real. But now, after months of fighting, something had changed within him. It wasn't just that he had managed to resist temptation for a day or two, it was deeper than that. He had truly experienced a shift in his spirit, a transformation that he had once thought impossible. He woke up that morning feeling different, not just physically but spiritually. It was as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, something he hadn't even realized he had been carrying for so long. For months, he had fought tirelessly, praying, fasting, seeking counsel, and most importantly, trusting that God would provide the strength he needed. And now, for the first time in a long time, he could feel it, the victory. The battle with sin had been a relentless one. There were times when he faltered, moments when he stumbled, but every time he picked himself back up. He knew that his strength had never come from his own willpower alone. It had come from God, and that was the realization that had given him hope. The grace of God had transformed him in ways he had never imagined. James couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. Just a few months ago, he had felt lost, trapped in a cycle that seemed unbreakable. The shame, the guilt, the fear, those had been his constant companions. But now those feelings seemed distant. It wasn't that he had forgotten them, but they no longer defined him. They no longer held power over him. He had learned that freedom didn't come from fighting the temptation itself. It wasn't about defeating sin in the moment, but about creating a new way of living, a new mindset that was grounded in faith. He had stopped trying to fight sin on his own and had instead leaned fully on God. And in doing so, he had been transformed. The victory for James wasn't just about overcoming the temptation. It was about learning to live a life of grace, to let go of the past, and to trust that God's mercy was greater than his failures. It was about recognizing that, while he could not change what had happened before, he could choose to live differently now, and in that choice, he found freedom. James had finally broken free from the shame that had once held him captive. He had found peace in the knowledge that God had forgiven him. He no longer saw himself as someone defined by his mistakes, but as someone who had been redeemed by the grace of God. This new understanding brought with it a sense of clarity, of purpose. He was no longer a slave to his desires, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with who he was. But the victory wasn't just about him. As he reflected on his journey, he realized that God had not only set him free for his own sake, he had been set free so that he could help others experience the same transformation. James felt a deep sense of calling, a desire to share his story with others, to help them find the same freedom that he had found. So, James began reaching out. He didn't have all the answers, but he had his story. And he knew that his story had power. He began talking to others who were struggling with the same temptation, the same battle. And as he shared his journey with them, he began to see their faces light up with hope. They began to believe that it was possible for them too, that they could overcome their struggles and live a life of grace. In those moments, James realized that the victory wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who was still fighting. It was for the people who felt trapped in their own cycles of sin and shame. It was for the ones who were too afraid to even try because they didn't believe they could win. James had been there. He had felt that way. But now, he had a new message to share. You can be free. You can experience the same grace and redemption that I have. As he continued to help others, James began to understand more deeply what it meant to live a life of grace. It wasn't just about resisting temptation. It was about living in a new reality, one where God's mercy and love were always available to him. Every day, he woke up with the knowledge that he was forgiven, that he was loved, and that he could live in victory over sin. This knowledge filled him with peace and strength, and it made him want to share it with the world. And so, James continued to walk in the victory he had found. It wasn't always easy, but every day was a new opportunity to trust in God's grace and to walk in the freedom he had received. He knew that the battle wasn't over. There would always be new challenges to face, new temptations to resist. But he also knew that he was no longer fighting alone. With God by his side, he was unstoppable. Now, I want to ask you, how does this story resonate with you? Do you see yourself in James's journey? Have you ever felt like you were trapped in your own struggles, unable to break free? What would it look like for you to step into the victory that James found, to walk in grace, and to live in freedom from sin? I'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections. Leave a comment below and share your story. Maybe, just maybe, your words will help someone else who is struggling. We're all in this together, and together, we can experience the freedom that God has for us. As we come to the end of this journey, I want you to take a moment and reflect on everything we've discussed. I know it hasn't been easy to listen to some of the truths that have been presented here. The struggle, the pain, and the overwhelming weight that James carried are things that many of us can relate to, whether we are fighting with the same issue or facing a different battle. But what's most important is that James's story doesn't just end in defeat. It ends in victory, a victory made possible through faith, prayer, and the strength that comes from trusting in God's grace. You see, the battle that James faced was not just about fighting against a habit or trying to resist temptation on his own. It was about understanding something much deeper, about realizing that true freedom only comes through surrender to God's will and allowing Him to work in our lives. It's easy to get caught up in the idea that we have to do everything by ourselves. But James's story is a beautiful reminder that God is always with us, ready to help us overcome our struggles. With His strength, we are capable of more than we ever thought possible. We've also seen how powerful community and support can be. James didn't fight alone, and neither should you. There is power in sharing our stories and reaching out for help when we need it. You are not alone in this fight, and there are people around you who can help guide you through the darkness and into the light. Whether it's through prayer, counsel, or simply a listening ear, community plays an essential role in our journey toward healing and freedom. What stands out the most in James's transformation is the role of grace. It's not something we can earn. It's a gift that's freely given to all of us. Through God's grace, James found the strength to overcome his struggles and walk in victory. This is something you too can experience. No matter what you've gone through or how many times you've stumbled, God's grace is always available, always ready to wash over you and make you whole again. There is no sin too great, no mistake too big for God to forgive. His love and mercy know no bounds. Now, I want to encourage you to take what we've learned today and apply it to your own life. Maybe you're in a season of struggle, or maybe you've experienced the same hopelessness that James once did. But just like him, you can overcome. You can step into the life that God has for you. It won't always be easy, but with His help, you can do it. Remember, it's about living in grace and knowing that you are always loved, always forgiven, and always capable of more than you think. If you've been inspired by James's story and want to dive deeper into similar topics, I've created a playlist just for you. This playlist is filled with videos that tackle different struggles, offer biblical insights, and provide practical steps for overcoming the challenges that we face in our everyday lives. It's not just about learning information, it's about transformation. These videos are designed to guide you on a path of healing, freedom, and spiritual growth. So if you want to continue this journey, I invite you to check out the playlist, where you'll find even more resources to help you in your walk of faith. And before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. This journey we've been on together is far from over, and your voice is an important part of this conversation. I want to hear how James's story impacted you. Have you experienced something similar in your life? What did you learn from today's video? What's one thing you're going to take away and apply to your own life? Leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts. I read every comment, and I can't wait to hear from you. Your words could be the encouragement someone else needs, so don't hesitate to share. Together, we can build a community that lifts each other up and supports one another in our journey toward healing and freedom. Thank you for being a part of this experience today. I believe that just like James, you too are on a path of victory. The battle may not be over, but the victory is already yours. Keep pressing on, keep trusting in God, and keep living in the freedom that He offers. God bless you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.